Hello, campers. How are you all doing tonight? Today's stream is gonna be a little something different, a little something new, something that we haven't actually really done before, something I've brought up before in past streams, that a few people expressed an interest in, and I thought, well, as we wind this camp of streaming fun to its ultimate close, I figured, why not? And for the last of the Team Annihilation streams to be a little bit more of a calmer one. And it's just me, you guys, just getting me tonight. I am Scoutmaster Xander, just gonna be telling some stories. Nice, calm, relaxing evening by the fire as you just get to hang out and get to reflect on what this past summer was and what it meant to all of you, what it meant to all of us, and, you know, just ponder how good it's been and the good times we've had. So, strap in, buckle up, rope yourself to a tree, do whatever you want. We're just gonna be hanging out, having some fun, and just having a good time. So, tonight's gonna be some story time, some campfire stories, but maybe not in the way you necessarily expect. If you're looking for eccentric tales of murder, bloodshed, and gore, well, Team Murder's Fire is just down the road, so you can always go there. But we're doing just some fun stories from various small books I have, and tonight's gonna be something a little mythical. I'm feeling as I specialize in events of fantastical adventure and whatnot. I have some interesting tales from one of my favorite mythologies, Norse mythology, and I figured I could share with you all. And I also have something a bit creepier, if we so feel inclined to delve into that. But for now, we will stick with the tales of the Aesir, the Vanir, of Asgard and Midgard, and of the Nine Realms as a whole. And we'll see where we go from there. For now, though, get yourself a drink, get yourself some s'mores, get yourself a snack, get a whole meal if you so desire. But, point being, this is something that you can listen to in the background if you so want. Don't feel inclined to keep your eyes peeled to the screen. It's just this. Just some fun ambient sound, some music, and my narration. So, feel free to get a snack, get a drink, and be ready to just hang out for the next few hours as we tell some stories and whatnot. You can warm yourself by our metaphysical internet fire, if you so please. But let's first poll the group. Like I said, we have some Norse stories, because it is a wondrous mythology that if you're not really familiar with it, well, I think you're missing out. But for now, let's take a look at what stories we have to offer from Norse mythology. Tonight's going to be read from the book Norse Mythology, assembled and edited by Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors, and whose works are very nice to read aloud to friends. I would be snuggled up in a blanket with the lights dim to replicate the feeling of it being nighttime. However, I need to read from these pages, and darkness is not conducive with reading. So, I will let you guys, the campers and our dedicated viewers, vote on which stories we're going to read tonight. Like I said, I have selections from this book, Norse Mythology, but I also have something more unsettling. A true and proper campfire story, to say the least. Something that is chilling. And we can read that. But I think we should do a couple of things. Let's start the night out simple, a little bit more fun, a little bit more interesting. And then as we close, and if we have time, we can move on to the good stuff, as they so put it. So, let's let's make some decisions, because I feel that since you, the lovely, amazing audience that has made Camp Streamix what it has been, you know, I feel like you guys get to have a say in what story you'd like to hear. So, I will read off the stories I have available, and we will go from there. You guys get to pick which one sounds most interesting, and there will be more than one if we have time. So, we'll start with the most popular, and then we'll move on from there. And remember, even though we're at the end of Camp Streamix here, just remember that I've made one hell of a comeback, so feel free to donate any amount of money and knock me up into first place. So, get on it. I hope I've set the audio to be decently soothing as it is now. Got some lovely campfire ambient sound courtesy of Sirenscape, and some music for our reading selections tonight, so we shall see how that goes. So, let's talk about what stories we have from Norse mythology. Regardless of what story we pick, I will be running through a brief introduction talking about some of the important players of Odin, of Thor, and of Loki. Because if you're not overly familiar with Norse mythology, or if your understanding comes from Marvel Comics, there are some differences that would be good to know going in. But yes, so, when it comes to the stories we have available, we have the story of before the beginning and after of the creation of the world and the death of Ymir. We have the story of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and the Nine Worlds. The story of Mimir's head and Odin's eye. The story of the treasures of the gods and the creation of Mjolnir. We have the story of the Master Builder and the Wall of Asgard. The story of the children of Loki. My personal favorite, the story of Freya's unusual wedding, which I think we will get to at some point tonight. We have the story of the Meet of Poets, which is also a fun one. Then there is Thor's journey to the land of the giants, the apples of immortality, the story of Gerd and Frey for all of you budding romantics, Hymir and Thor's fishing expedition, the death of Balder, the last days of Loki, and yes, of course, Ragnarok. So, just to recap, and the chat gets to pick based on whoever spams it the most. No, I am joking, do not spam, simply type what you want to hear. I will recap one more time for anyone who may have missed. Essentially, the story of the creation of the world, a brief rundown of the World Tree and the Nine Worlds, story of Mimir's head, story of the treasure of the gods. Now, it is worth noting that these are not necessarily in order of occurrence, so I can't necessarily, so starting at the beginning is not necessarily, you know, a thing that is in chronological order. So, let's see what everyone has to say. My big fat Norse wedding, or the one where Kratos killed Balder? Well, I'm afraid Kratos is not in this story. We will start at the beginning, though. I think it is best to begin... you know what, let's do that. Let us begin at the beginning and go from there, and maybe then dive into the story of Freya's wedding, since that is quite a good one. So, let's get some suitable music playing. Something to set the mood. Oh yes, that is quite good. And yes, this is royalty free and absolutely legal for me to use, so don't worry, we are not going to be demonetized because of this. I have done my research. This lovely Norse music, courtesy of the extremely talented musician, Adrian von Ziegler. You can find him on YouTube, and he is gracious enough to allow us to use his music for free, as long as he is credited where credit is due. So, let's jump in. Let's start with a little bit of a primer for what you should know. There are many gods and goddesses named in Norse mythology. You will meet quite a few of them tonight. Most of the stories, however, concern two gods, Odin and his son Thor, and Odin's blood brother, a giant son called Loki, who lives with the Aesir in Asgard. Odin. The highest and the oldest of all the gods is Odin. Odin knows many secrets. He gave an eye for wisdom. More than that, for knowledge of runes and for power, he sacrificed himself to himself. He hung from the world tree, Yggdrasil, hung there for 9 nights. His side was pierced by the point of a spear which wounded him gravely. The wind clutched at him, buffeted his body as it hung. Nothing did he eat for 9 days or 9 nights. Nothing did he drink. He was alone there, in pain, the light of his life slowly going out. He was cold, in agony, and on the point of death, when his sacrifice bore fruit. In the ecstasy of his agony, he looked down, and the runes were revealed to him. He knew them, and understood them and their power. The rope broke them, and he fell, screaming from the tree. Now he understood magic. Now the world was his to control. Odin has many names. He is the Allfather, the Lord of the Slain, the Gallows God. He is the god of cargoes and of prisoners. He is called Grimnir and Third. He has different names in every country, for he is worshipped in different forms and in many tongues, but it is always Odin they worship. He travels from place to place in disguise, to see the world as people see it. When he walks among us, he does so as a tall man, wearing a cloak and hat. He has 2 ravens, whom he calls Hugin and Munin, which mean thought and memory. These birds fly back and forth across the world, seeking news and bringing Odin all the knowledge of things. They perch on his shoulders and whisper into his ears. When he sits on his high throne at Hlidskjalf, he observes all things, wherever they may be. Nothing can be hidden from him. He brought war into the world. Battles are begun by throwing a spear at the hostile army, declaring, or rather dedicating, the battle and its deaths to Odin. If you survive in battle, it is with Odin's grace, and if you fall, it is because he has betrayed you. If you fall bravely in war, the Valkyries, beautiful battle maidens who collect the souls of the noble dead, will take you and bring you to the hall known as Valhalla. He will be waiting for you in Valhalla, and there you will drink and feast and fight and battle, with Odin as your leader. Thor. Thor, Odin's son, is the Thunderer. He is straightforward where his father Odin is cunning, good-natured where his father is devious. Huge he is, and red-bearded and strong, by far the strongest of all the gods. His might is increased by his belt of strength, Megingjord. When he wears it, his strength is doubled. Thor's weapon is Mjolnir, a remarkable hammer forged for him by dwarves. Its story you will learn. Trolls and frost giants and mountain giants all tremble when they see Mjolnir, for it has killed so many of their brothers and friends. Thor wears iron gloves, which help him to grip the hammer's shaft. Thor's mother was Jord, the earth goddess. Thor's sons are Modi the angry and Magni the strong. Thor's daughter is Thrud, the powerful. His wife is Sif of the golden hair. She had a son, Uller, before she married Thor, and Thor is Uller's stepfather. Uller is a god who hunts with bow and with arrows, and he is the god with skis. Thor is the defender of Asgard and of Midgard. There are many stories about Thor and his adventures. You will encounter some of them here. Loki is very handsome. He is plausible, convincing, likable, and far away the most wily, subtle, and shrewd of all the inhabitants of Asgard. It is a pity, then, that there is so much darkness inside him, so much anger, so much envy, so much lust. Loki is the son of Laufey, who was also known as Nal, or Needle, because she was slim and beautiful and sharp. His father was said to be Farbauti, a giant. His name means he who strikes dangerous blows, and Farbauti was as dangerous as his name. Loki walks in the sky with shoes that fly, and he can transform his shape so he looks like other people or change into animal form. But his real weapon is his mind. He is more cunning, subtler, trickier than any god or giant. Not even Odin is as cunning as Loki. Loki is Odin's blood brother. The other gods do not know when Loki came to Asgard, or how. He is Thor's friend and Thor's betrayer. He is tolerated by the gods, perhaps because his stratagems and plans save them as often as they get them into trouble. Loki makes the world more interesting, but less safe. He is the father of monsters, the author of woes, the sly god. Loki drinks too much, and he cannot guard his words, or his thoughts, or his deeds when he drinks. Loki and his children will be there for Ragnarok, the end of everything, and it will not be on the side of the gods of Asgard that they will fight. Before the beginning and after. Before the beginning, there was nothing. No earth, no heavens, no stars, no sky. Only the mist world, formless and shapeless, and the fire world, always burning. To the north was Niflheim, the dark world. Here 11 poisonous rivers cut through the mist, each springing from the same well at the center of it all, the roaring maelstrom, called Hvergelmir. Niflheim was colder than cold, and the murky mist that cloaked everything hung heavily. The skies were hidden by mist, and the ground was clouded by the chilly fog. To the south was Muspel. Muspel was fire. Everything there glowed and burned. Muspel was light where Niflheim was gray, molten lava where the mist world was frozen. The land was aflame with the roaring heat of a blacksmith's fire. There was no solid earth, no sky, nothing but sparks and spurting heat, molten rocks, and burning embers. In Muspel, at the edge of the flame, where the mist burns into light, where the land ends, stood Surtur, who existed before the gods. He stands there now. He holds a flaming sword, and the bubbling lava and the freezing mist are as one to him. It is said that at Ragnarok, which is the end of the world, and only then, Surtur will leave his station. He will go forth from Muspel with his flaming sword and burn the world with fire, and one by one the gods will fall before him. Between Muspel and Niflheim was a void, an empty place of nothingness without form. The rivers of the mist world flowed into the void, which was called Gnungagap, the yawning gap. Over time beyond measure, these poisoned rivers in the region between fire and mist slowly solidified into huge glaciers. The ice in the north of the void was covered in frozen fog and pellets of hail, but to the south, where the glaciers reached the land of fire, the embers and the sparks from Muspel melt the ice, and warm winds from the flames made the air above the ice as gentle and as comfortable as a spring day. Where the ice and the fire met, the ice melted, and in the melting waters life appeared. The likeness of a person bigger than worlds, huger than any giant there will be or ever has been. This was neither male, nor was it female, but was both at the same time. This creature was the ancestor of all the giants, and it called itself Ymir. Ymir was not the only living thing to be formed by the melting of the ice. There was also a hornless cow, more enormous than the mind could hold. She licked the salty blocks of ice for food and for drink, and the milk that ran from her 4 udders flowed like rivers. It was this milk that nourished Ymir. The giant drank the milk, and grew. Ymir called the cow Audhumla. The cow's pink tongue licked people from the blocks of ice. The first day, only a man's hair. The second, his head. And the third day, the shape of the whole man was revealed. This was Buri, the ancestor of the gods. Ymir slept, and while it slept, it gave birth. A male and a female giant were born from beneath Ymir's left arm, a 6-headed giant born from its legs. From these, Ymir's children, all giants, are descended. Buri took a wife from among these giants, and they had a son, whom they called Bor. Bor married Bestla, daughter of a giant, and together they had 3 sons: Odin, Vili, and Vi. Odin and Vili and Vi, the 3 sons of Bor, grew into manhood. They saw as they grew far off the flames of Muspel and the darkness of Niflheim. But they knew that each place would be death to them. The brothers were trapped forever in Ginnungagap, the vast gap between the fire and the mist. They might as well have been nowhere. There was no sea and no sand, no grass nor rock, no soil, no trees, no sky, no stars. There was no world, no heaven, and no earth at that time. The gap was nowhere, only an empty place waiting to be filled with life and with existence. It was time for the creation of everything. Vi and Vili and Odin looked at each other and spoke of what was needful to do there in the void of Ginnungagap. They spoke of the universe and of life and of the future. Odin and Vili and Vi killed the giant Ymir. It had to be done. There was no other way to make the worlds. This was the beginning of all things, the death that made all life possible. They stabbed the great giant. Blood gushed out from Ymir's corpse in unimaginable quantities. Fountains of blood as salt as the sea and gray as the oceans gushed out in a flood so sudden, so powerful, and so deep that it swept away and drowned all the giants. Only one giant, Bergelmir, Ymir's grandson, and his wife survived, by clambering onto a wooden box which bore them like a boat. All the giants we see and we fear today are descended from them. Odin and his brothers made the soil from Ymir's flesh. Ymir's bones they piled up into mountains and cliffs. Our rocks and pebbles, the sand and gravel you see, these were Ymir's teeth, and the fragments of bone that were broken and crushed by Odin and Vili and Vi in their battle with Ymir. The seas that girdle the worlds, these were Ymir's blood and his sweat. Look up into the sky. You are looking at the inside of Ymir's skull. The stars you see at night, the planets, all the comets and the shooting stars, these are the sparks that flew from the fires of Muspel. And the clouds you see by day, these were once Ymir's brains, and who knows what thoughts they are thinking, even now. The world is a flat disk, and the sea encircles the perimeter. Giants live at the edges of the world, beside the deepest seas. To keep the giants at bay, Odin and Vili and Vi made a wall from Ymir's eyelashes and set it around the middle of the world. They called the place within the wall Midgard. Midgard was empty. The lands were beautiful, but nobody walked the meadows or fished in the clear waters. Nobody explored the rocky mountains or stared up at the clouds. Odin and Vili and Vi knew that a world is not a world until it is inhabited. They wandered high and low, looking for people, and they found nothing. At last, on the rocky shingle at the edge of the sea, they found 2 logs, sea-tossed, that had floated there on the tides and been cast ashore. The first log was a log of ash wood. The ash tree is resilient and handsome, and its roots go deep. Its wood carves well and will not split or crack. Ashwood makes a good tool handle or the shaft of a spear. The second log they found, beside the first on the beach, so close to the first log they were almost touching, was a log of elm wood. The elm tree is graceful, but its wood is hard, enough to be made into the toughest planks and beams. You can build a fine home or hall from elm wood. The gods took the 2 logs. They set the logs so they were upright on the sand, the height of people. Odin held them, and one by one he breathed life into them. No longer were they dead logs on a beach. Now they were alive. Vili gave them will. He gave them intelligence and drive. Now they could move, and they could want. Vi carved the logs. He gave them the shape of people. He carved their ears that they might hear, and their eyes that they might see, and lips that they might speak. The 2 logs stood on the beach, 2 naked people. Vi had carved one with male genitals, the other he had carved female. The three brothers made clothes for the woman and the man, to cover themselves and to keep them warm in the chilly sea spray on the beach at the end of the world. Last of all, they gave the two people they had made names. The man they called Ask, or Ash Tree. The woman they called Embla, or Elm. Ask and Embla were the father and the mother of all of us. Every human being owes its life to its parents and their parents before them. Go far enough back, and the ancestors of each of us were Ask and Embla. Embla and Ask stayed in Midgard, safe behind the wall the gods had made from Ymir's eyelashes. In Midgard, they would make their homes, protected from giants and monsters and all the dangers that wait in the wastes. In Midgard, they could raise their children in peace. That is why Odin is called the Allfather, because he was the father of the gods, and because he breathed the breath of life into our grandparents' grandparents' grandparents. Whether we are gods or mortals, Odin is the father of us all. And now you know the creation of the world. Now then, what story would you folk like to hear tonight? The story of Thor's unusual wedding? Or would you like to hear more about the Nine Realms? Do you want to hear about Mimir's well and how Odin sacrificed his eye? That's up to you. I'll let you decide. If we have time, we'll save Ragnarok for last. But we shall see. What do you people say? Looks like we got a few for wedding so far. A few hands raised. A lot of hands raised. It seems everyone wants to hear the wedding story. Which, in all honesty, is quite a good story. Well then, let us start with that then. Even though this takes place after a few of the other stories, it doesn't really matter. Think back to when these stories were told around campfires hundreds of years ago. They were told as the audience saw fit. They were not necessarily told in chronological order. So, let us now move to the story of Freya's unusual wedding, and we will embrace the oddities that it has to offer. This is excellent music for reading, I'm not gonna lie. How much longer do I have on the track? I'll have to loop it at some point. Oh yeah, it's almost over. I'll loop it when it comes time. What page are you on? Ah yes, page 107. Thank you, Neil Gaiman. Now, while we might not read all these stories, I highly recommend that if you guys want to read these stories for yourselves, you should pick up a copy of Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. It is a hell of a read. It's really good. Now then. Let us continue. Oh boy, this one will actually have voices, you guys. That'll be interesting. Yes, Miss Fox, I am reading Gaiman's work, because it is the best work. Thor, god of thunder, mightiest of all the Aesir, the strongest, the bravest, the most valiant in battle, was not entirely awake yet. But he had the feeling that something was wrong. He reached out a hand for his hammer, which he always kept within reach while he slept. He fumbled around with his eyes closed. He groped about, reaching for the comfortable and familiar shaft of his hammer. No hammer. Thor opened his eyes. He sat up. He stood up. He walked around the room. There was no hammer anywhere. His hammer was gone. Thor's hammer was called Mjolnir. It had been made for Thor by the dwarfs Brock and Itri. It was one of the treasures of the gods. If Thor hit anything with it, that thing would be destroyed. If he threw the hammer at something, the hammer would never miss its target, and always fly back through the air and return to his hand. He could shrink the hammer down and hide it in his cloak, and he could make it grow again. It was a perfect hammer in all things except one. It was slightly too short for the handle. which meant that Thor had to swing it one-handed. The hammer kept the gods of Asgard safe from all the dangers that menaced them and the world. Frost giants and ogres, trolls and monsters of every kind, all were frightened by Thor's hammer. Thor loved his hammer, and his hammer simply was not there. There were things Thor did when something went wrong. The first thing he did was ask himself if what had happened was Loki's fault. Thor pondered. He did not believe that even Loki would have dared to steal his hammer, so he did the next thing he did when something went wrong, and he went to ask Loki for advice. Loki was crafty. Loki would tell him what to do. "Don't tell anyone," said Thor to Loki, "but the hammer of the gods has been stolen." "That," said Loki, making a face, "is not good news. Let me see what I can find out." Loki went to Freya's hall. Freya was the most beautiful of all the gods. Her golden hair tumbled about her shoulders, and it glinted in the morning light. Freya's 2 cats prowled the room, eager to pull her chariot. Around her neck, as golden and shining as her hair, glittered the necklace of the Brisings, made for Freya by dwarfs far underground. "I'd like to borrow your feathered cloak," said Loki, "the one that lets you fly." "Absolutely not," said Freya. "That cloak is the most valuable thing I possess. It's more valuable than gold. I'm not having you wearing it and going around and making mischief." "Thor's hammer has been stolen," said Loki. "I need to find it." "I'll get you the cloak," said Freya. Loki put on the feathered cloak and he took to the air in falcon shape. He flew beyond Asgard. He flew deep into the land of the giants, looking for something unusual. Beneath him, Loki saw a huge grave mound, and sitting on it, plaiting a dog collar, was the hugest, ugliest ogre of a giant he had ever seen. When the ogre saw Loki in falcon shape, he grinned a sharp-toothed grin and waved.
"What's up with the ace here, Loki? What's the news from the elves, and why have you come alone into the land of the giants?"
Loki landed beside the ogre. "There's nothing but bad news from Asgard, and nothing but bad news from the elves."
"Really?"
said the ogre, and he chuckled to himself, as if he were extremely pleased with something he had done, and thought himself remarkably clever. Loki recognized that sort of chuckle. Sometimes he did it himself. "Thor's hammer is missing," said Loki. "Would you know anything about that?" The ogre scratched his armpit, and he chuckled once more.
"I might,"
he admitted. Then he said,
"How's Freya? Is she as beautiful as they say?"
"If you like that sort of thing," said Loki.
"Oh, I do,"
said the ogre.
"I do."
There was another uncomfortable silence. The ogre put the dog collar down on a pile of dog collars and began to plait another.
"I have Thor's hammer," the ogre told Loki. "I've hidden it so deep beneath the earth that nobody could ever find it, not even Odin. I am the only one who could bring it up again, and I will return it to Thor if you bring me what I want."
"I can ransom the hammer," said Loki. "I can bring you gold and amber. I can bring you treasures beyond counting."
"Don't want them," said the ogre. "I want to marry Freya. Bring her here in 8 days from now. I'll return the hammer of the gods as a bride gift on Freya's wedding night."
"Who are you?" asked Loki. The ogre grinned and showed his crooked teeth.
"Why, Loki, son of Loki, I am Thrym, lord of the ogres."
"I have no doubt that we can come to an agreement, great Thrym," said Loki. He drew Freya's feathered cloak around him, then stretched his arms and took to the skies. Beneath Loki, the world seemed very small. He looked down at the trees and the mountains, tiny as children's playthings, and the problems of the gods seemed a small thing also. Thor was waiting for him in the court of the gods. And before Loki had even landed, he found himself seized by Thor's huge hands.
"Well,
You know something. I can see it in your face. Tell me whatever you know and tell it now. I don't trust you, Loki, and I want to know what you know right this moment before you've had a chance to plot and to plan. Loki, who plotted and planned as easily as other folk breathed in and out, smiled at Thor's anger and innocence. Your hammer has been stolen by Thrym, Lord of the Ogres, he said. I have persuaded him to return it to you, but he demands a price. Fair enough, said Thor. What's the price? Freya's hand in marriage. He just wants a hand? Asked Thor hopefully. She had 2 hands after all, and might be persuaded to give up one of them without too much of an argument. Tyr had, after all. All of her, said Loki. He wants to marry her. Oh, said Thor. She won't like that. Well, you can tell her the news. You're better at persuading people to do things than I am when I'm not holding my hammer. They went to Freya's court once more. Here's your feathered cloak, said Loki. Thank you, said Freya. Did you find out who stole Thor's hammer? Thrym, Lord of the Ogres. I've heard him. A nasty piece of work. What does he want for it? You, said Loki. He wants to marry you. Freya nodded. Thor was pleased that she had seemed to have accepted the idea so easily. Put on your bridal crown, Freya, and pack your things, he said. You and Loki are going to the land of the giants. We need to get you married off to Thrym before he changes his mind. I want my hammer back. Freya did not say anything. Thor noticed that the ground was shaking, as were the walls. Freya's cats mewed and hissed, and they fled beneath the chest of furs and would not come out. Freya's hands were squeezed into tight fists. The necklace of the Brisings tumbled from her neck to the floor. She did not appear to notice. She was staring at Thor and Loki as if they were the lowest, most unpleasant vermin she had ever seen. Thor was almost relieved when Freya began to speak. What kind of a person do you think I am? She asked very quietly. Do you think I am that foolish, that disposable, that I'm someone who would actually marry an ogre just to get you out of trouble? If you two think that I am going to the land of the giants, that I'll put on a bridal crown and veil and submit to the touch of the lust of that ogre, that I'd marry him, well... She stopped talking. The walls shuddered once more, and Thor feared the entire building would fall upon them. Get out, said Freya. What kind of a woman do you think I am? But my hammer, said Thor. Shut up, Thor, said Loki. Thor shut up. They left. She's very beautiful when she's angry, said Thor. You can see why the ogre wants to marry her. Shut up, Thor, said Loki again. They called a gathering of all the gods in the great hall. Every god and goddess was there except Freya, who declined to leave her house. All day they talked, debated, and argued. There was no question that they needed to get Mjolnir back, but how? Each god and goddess made a suggestion, and each suggestion was shot down by Loki. In the end, only one god had not spoken. Heimdall, the far-seeing, who watches over the world. Not one thing happens that Heimdall does not see, and sometimes he sees events that have yet to occur in the world. Well, said Loki, what about you, Heimdall? Do you have any suggestions? I do, said Heimdall, but you won't like it. Thor banged his fist down onto the table. It does not matter whether we like it or not, he said. We are gods. There is nothing that any of us gathered here would not do to get back Mjolnir, the hammer of the gods. Tell us your idea, and if it is a good idea, we will like it. You won't like it, said Heimdall. We will like it. Well, said Heimdall, I think we should dress Thor as a bride. Have him put on the necklace of the Brisings. Have him wear a bridal crown. Stuff his dress so he looks like a woman. Veil his face. We'll have him wear keys that jingle, as women do. Drape him with jewels. I don't like it, said Thor. People will think... Well, for a start, they'll think I dress up in women's clothes. Absolutely out of the question. I don't like it. I am definitely not going to be wearing a bridal veil. None of us like this idea, do we? Terrible, terrible idea. I've got a beard. I can't shave off my beard. Shut up, Thor, said Loki, son of Laufey. It's an excellent idea. If you don't want the giants to invade Asgard, you will put on a wedding veil which will hide your face and your beard. Odin, the All-Highest, said, It is indeed an excellent idea. Well done, Heimdall. We need the hammer back, and this is the best way. Goddesses, prepare Thor for his wedding night. The goddesses brought him things to wear. Frigg and Fulla, Sif, Idun, and the rest, even Skadi, Freya's stepmother, came and helped to prepare him. They dressed him in the finest clothes, the kind a highborn goddess would wear to her wedding. Frigg went to see Freya and came back with the necklace of the Brisings, and she hung it about Thor's neck. Sif, Thor's wife, hung her keys at Thor's side. Idun brought all her jewels, which she draped about Thor so that he glittered and gleamed in the candlelight, and she brought 100 rings of red gold and white gold to go on Thor's fingers. They covered his face with a veil so that only his eyes could be seen, and Var, the goddess of marriage, placed a shining headdress upon Thor's head, a bridal crown high and wide and beautiful. I'm not sure about the eyes, Var said. They don't look very feminine. I should hope not, muttered Thor. Var looked at Thor. If I pull down the headdress, it will hide them, but he still has to be able to be seen. Do your best, said Loki, and then he said, I'll be your maidservant and go with you to the land of the giants. Loki shifted his shape, and now what he was, in voice and appearance, a beautiful young serving woman. There, how do I look? Thor muttered something under his breath, but it might have been a good thing and nobody could hear it. Or rather, it might have been a good thing that nobody could hear it. Loki and Thor clambered into Thor's chariot, and the goats who pulled it, Sarlar and Grinder, leapt into the skies, eager to be off. Mountains broke in half as they passed, and the earth burst into flames beneath them. I have a bad feeling about this, said Thor. Don't speak, said Loki in the form of a maiden. Let me do all the talking. Can you remember that? If you speak, you may ruin everything. Thor grunted. They landed in the courtyard. Giant-sized, jet-black oxen stood impassively. Each beast was larger than a house. The tips of their horns were capped with gold, and the courtyard stank with the sharp smell of their dung. A booming voice could be heard from inside the huge high hall. Move it, you fools! Spread clean straw on the benches! What do you think you're doing? Well, pick it up and cover it with new straw. Don't just leave it there to rot. This is Freya, the most beautiful creature in existence, Njord's daughter, who comes to us. She won't want to see something like that. There was a path made of fresh straw through the courtyard, and after leaving their chariot, the disguised Thor and the serving maiden who was Loki walked across the straw, lifting their skirts so they did not drag in the muck. A giant woman was waiting for them. She introduced herself as Thrym's sister, and she reached down and pinched Loki's pretty cheeks between her fingernails, and she prodded Thor with one sharp fingernail. So, this is the most beautiful woman in the world. Doesn't look much to me. And when she picked up her skirts, it seemed to me that her ankles were as thick as small tree trunks. A trick of the light. She is the most beautiful of all the gods, said the maiden who was Loki smoothly. When her veil comes off, I promise you will be struck down by her beauty. Now, where is her groom? Where is the wedding feast? She is so eager for this, I have barely been able to restrain her. The sun was setting as they were led into the great hall for the wedding feast. What if he wants me to sit next to him? Whispered Thor to Loki. You have to sit next to him. That's where the bride sits. Well, he might try and put his hand on my leg, Thor whispered urgently. I'll sit between you, said Loki. I'll tell him it's our custom. Thrym sat at the head of the table, and Loki sat next to him with Thor and the next seat on the bench. Thrym clapped his hands and giant serving men came in. They carried 5 whole roast oxen, enough to feed the giants. They brought in 20 whole baked salmon, each fish the size of a 10-year-old boy. Also, they carried in dozens of trays of little pastries and fancies intended for the women. They were followed by 5 more serving men, each one carrying a whole cask of mead, a barrel huge enough that each giant struggled beneath the weight of it.
"This meal is for the beautiful Freya,"
said Thrym, and he might have said something else, but Thor had already started to eat and to drink, and it would have been rude for Thrym to have talked while the bride-to-be was eating. A tray of pastries for the womenfolk was placed in front of Loki and Thor. Loki carefully picked out the smallest pastry. Thor just as carefully swept the rest of the pastries up, and they vanished to the sound of munching under the veil. The other women, who had been looking at the pastries hungrily, glared, disappointed at the beautiful Freya. But the beautiful Freya had not even begun to eat. Thor ate a whole ox all by himself. He ate 7 entire salmon, leaving nothing but the bones. Each time a tray of pastries was brought to him, he devoured all the fancies and pastries on it, leaving all the other women hungry. Sometimes Loki would kick him under the table, but Thor ignored every kick and just kept eating. Thrym tapped Loki on the shoulder.
"Excuse me," he said, "but the lovely Freya has just polished off her 3rd cask of mead."
"I'm sure she has," said the maiden who was Loki.
"Amazing. I've never seen any woman eat so ravenously, never seen any woman eat so much or drink so much mead."
"There is," said Loki, "an obvious explanation." He took a deep breath and watched Thor inhale another whole salmon and pull a salmon skeleton out from under his veil. It was like watching a magic trick. He wondered what the obvious explanation was.
"That makes 8 salmon she's eaten," said Thrym.
8 days and 8 nights, said Loki suddenly. She hasn't eaten for 8 days and 8 nights. She was so keen to come to the land of the giants and make love to her new husband. Now she is in your presence. She is finally eating again. The maiden turned to Thor. "It's so good to see you eating again, my dear," she said. Thor glared at Loki from beneath the veil. "I should kiss her," said Thrym. "I wouldn't advise it. Not yet," said Loki, but Thrym had already leaned over and was making kissing noises. With one huge hand, he reached for Thor's veil. The maiden who was Loki put out her arm to stop him, but it was too late. Thrym had already stopped making kissing noises and had sprung back, shaken. Thrym tapped the maiden who was Loki on the shoulder.
"Can I talk with you?"
he said. "Of course." They got up and walked across the hall.
"Why are Freya's eyes so terrifying?" asked Thrym. "It seemed as if there was a fire burning inside them. Those weren't the eyes of a beautiful woman."
"Of course not," said the maiden who was Loki smoothly. "You wouldn't expect them to be. She hasn't slept for 8 days and 8 nights, mighty Thrym. She was so consumed by love for you that she dared not sleep. She was so mad to taste your love. She's burning up inside for you. That's what you're seeing in those eyes. Burning passion."
"Oh," said Thrym. "I see."
He smiled and licked his lips with a tongue bigger than a human pillow.
"Well then."
They walked back to the table. Thrym's sister had sat down in Loki's seat beside Thor and was tapping her fingernails on Thor's hand. "If you know what's good for you, you'll give me your rings," she was saying. "All your pretty golden rings. You'll be a stranger in this castle. You'll need someone looking out for you. Otherwise, things are going to get pretty nasty so far from home. You've got so many rings. Give me some as a bridal gift. So pretty they are, all gold and red." "Isn't it time for the wedding?" asked Loki.
"It is," said Thrym. He boomed at the top of his voice. "Bring in the hammer to sanctify the bride. I want to see Mjolnir placed on the beautiful Freya's lap. Let Var, the goddess of pledges between men and women, bless and consecrate our love."
It took 4 giants to carry Thor's hammer. They brought it in from the deep inside the hall. It glinted dully in the firelight. With difficulty, they placed it on Thor's lap.
"Now," said Thrym, "now let me see your beautiful voice. Or rather hear your beautiful voice, my love, my dove, my sweetness. Tell me that you love me. Tell me that you will be my bride. Tell me that you pledge yourself to me as a woman have pledged themselves to men, and men to women, since the beginning of time. What do you say?"
Thor held the haft of his hammer with a hand that was covered in golden rings. He squeezed it reassuringly. It felt familiar and comfortable in his hand. He started laughing then, a deep, booming laugh.
"What I say," said Thor in a voice like thunder, "is that you should not have taken my hammer."
He hit Thrym with his hammer, only once, but once was all it took. The ogre fell to the straw-covered floor and did not rise again. All the giants and ogres fell beneath Thor's hammer, the guests at the wedding that never to be. Even Thrym's sister, who received a bridal gift she had not been expecting. And when the hall was silent, Thor called,
"Loki!"
Loki climbed out from under the table in his original shape and surveyed the carnage.
"Well," he said, "you appear to have dealt with the problem."
Thor was already taking off his women's skirts with relief. He stood there wearing nothing but a shirt in a room filled with dead giants.
"There, that wasn't as bad as I'd feared," he said cheerfully. "I've got my hammer back, and I had a good dinner. Let's go home."
The end. I hope you can see why that is one of my favorite stories from the book. So, let's take a moment so Scoutmaster Xander can get some more water to quench his dry throat, and you all can sit here with the fire and with some calm music. So, don't go anywhere. I'll just be a couple of minutes. And we're back. Well, there are plenty more stories to tell tonight, plenty more adventures to delve into. What would you guys like to hear next? We have mentioned the story of how Thor has reclaimed Mjolnir from the land of the giants, but what of the story of how Mjolnir came to be? Or the story of the death of Balder? Or the story of Loki's children? Or of the Great Wall and the Master Builder? What do you think, campers? Which do you wish to hear? Plenty of time, plenty of stories to tell. Got some hands for the death of Balder, got some hands for the hammer. let's see what everyone else thinks. A couple more hands to go up. Both stories are in their own right quite entertaining, although one is much more tragic than the other. See, not all stories from the Aesir and the Vanir are, well, they're not entirely adventurous. Some are more tragic. But let's see what people have to say. We have a couple of votes for the death of Balder, a couple of votes for Loki's children, a couple of votes for the treasures of the gods. Just a few more and we can definitively say one way or the other. The story of Loki's children is quite interesting. Welcome back, some scampers. Some people want to see Loki's children. Yes, I mean, we could certainly do that. I think that's entirely plausible. Seems like people like Loki stories, and it seems like the vote is in favor of Loki's children. Sure, we can tell that. Let's get some more appropriate music going. Once I can go back to some more of my free Norse playlists to do this with. Feel free to donate bits to vote for what stories you want to hear tonight as well. I also accept those. So, it looks like people want the story of Loki's children and the story of the death of Balder. Alright, we can tell those. Alrighty then. Let us do that then. So, this is the story of Loki's children. I need to find the page first. 91. Here we are. The Children of Loki. Loki was handsome, and he knew it. People wanted to be him. Well, rather, people wanted... I shall start over. Scoutmaster needs to start over. Scoutmaster needs another drink. Loki was handsome, and he knew it. People wanted to like him, they wanted to believe him, but he was undependable and self-centered at best, mischievous or evil at worst. He married a woman named Sigyn, who had been happy and beautiful when Loki courted and married her, but now always looked like she was expecting bad news. She bore him a son, Narfi, and shortly afterward, another son, Vali. Sometimes Loki would vanish for long periods and not return, and then Sigyn would look like she was expecting the very worst news of all, but always Loki would come back to her, looking shifty and guilty and also as if he were very proud of himself indeed. 3 times he went away, 3 times he, eventually, returned. The 3rd time Loki returned to Asgard, Odin called Loki to him. "I have dreamed a dream," said the wise old one-eyed god. "You have children." "I have a son, Nafi, a good boy, although I must confess that he does not always listen to his father, and another son, Vali, obedient and restrained." "Not them. You have 3 other children, Loki. You have been sneaking off to spend your days and your nights in the land of the frost giants with Angraboda, the giantess, and she has borne you 3 children. I have seen them in the eye of my mind as I sleep, and my visions tell me they will be the greatest foes of the gods in the time that is to come." Loki said nothing. He tried to look ashamed and succeeded simply in looking pleased with himself. Odin called the gods to him, with Tyr and Thor at their head, and he told them that they would be journeying far into Jotunheim, to Giant Land, to bring Loki's children to Asgard. The gods traveled into the land of the giants, battling many dangers until they reached Angerboda's keep. She was not expecting them, and she had left her children playing together in the great hall. The gods were shocked when they saw what Loki and Angerboda's children were, but that did not deter them. They seized the children and they bound them. And they carried the oldest between them, tied to the stripped trunk of a pine tree, and they muzzled the second child with a muzzle made from knotted willow, and they put a rope around its neck as a leash, while the third child walked beside them, gloomy and disturbing. Those on the right of the third child saw a beautiful young girl, while those on the left tried not to look at her, for they saw a dead girl, her skin and flesh rotted black, walking in their midst. "Have you noticed something?" Thor asked Tyr on the third day of their journey back from the land of the frost giants. They had camped for the night in a small clearing, and Tyr was scratching the furry neck of Loki's second child with his huge right hand. "What?" "They are not following us, the giants. Not even the creature's mother has come after us. It's as if they want us to take Loki's children out of Jotunheim." "That's foolish talk," said Tyr. But as he said it, even though the fire was warm, he shivered. 2 more days of hard traveling and they were in Odin's hall. "These are the children of Loki," said Tyr shortly. The first of Loki's children was tied to a pine tree and was now longer than the pine tree it was tied to. It was called Jormungandr, and it was a serpent. "It has grown many feet in the days we have carried it back," said Tyr. Thor said, "Careful. It can spit burning black venom. It spat its poison at me, but it missed. That's why we tied its head to the tree like that." "It is a child," said Odin. "It is still growing. We will send it where it can harm nobody." Odin took the serpent to the shore of the sea that lies beyond all lands, the sea that circles Midgard, and there on the shore he freed Jormungandr, and watched it slither and slip between the waves and swim away in loops and curls. Odin watched it with his one eye until it was lost on the horizon, and he wondered if he had done the right thing. He did not know. He had done as his dreams had told him, but dreams know more than they reveal, even to the wisest of the gods. The serpent would grow beneath the waves of the world ocean, grow until it encircled the earth. Folk would call Jormungandr the Midgard serpent. Odin returned to the great hall as he ordered Loki's daughter to step forward. He stared at the girl. On the right side of her face, her cheek was pink and white. Her eye was the green of Loki's eyes. Her lips were full and carmine. On the left side of her face, the skin was blotched and striated, swollen in the bruises of death. Her sightless eye rotted and pale. Her lipless mouth wizened and stretched over skull brown teeth. "What do they call you, girl?" asked the All-Father.
"They call me Hel," she said, "if it pleases you, All-Father."
"You are a polite child," said Odin. "I'll give you that." Hel said nothing, only looked at him with her single green eye, sharp as an ice chip, and her pallid eye, dull and spoiled and dead, and he saw no fear in her. "Are you alive?" he asked the girl, "or are you a corpse?"
"I am only myself, Hel, daughter of Angerboda and of Loki," she said, "and I like the dead best of all. They are simple things, and they talk to me with respect. The living look at me with revulsion."
Odin contemplated the girl, and he remembered his dreams. Then Odin said, "This child will be the ruler of the deepest of the dark places, and ruler of the dead of all the 9 worlds. She will be the queen of those poor souls who die in an unworthy ways, of disease or of an old age, of accidents or in childbirth. Warriors who die in battle will always come to us here in Valhalla, but the dead who die in other ways will be her folk to attend to her in her darkness." For the first time since she had been taken from her mother, the girl Hel smiled, with half a mouth. Odin took Hel down to the lightless world, and he showed her the immense hall in which she would receive her subjects, and watched as she named her possessions.
I will call my bowl hunger, said Hel. She picked up a knife. This is called famine, and my bed is called sickbed.
That was 2 of Loki's children with Angerboda dealt with then. 1 in the ocean, 1 to the darkness beneath the earth. But what to do with the 3rd? When they had brought the 3rd and smallest of Loki's children back from the land of the giants, it had been puppy-sized, and Tyr had scratched its neck and its head and played with it, removing its willow muzzle first. It was a wolf cub, gray and black with eyes the color of dark amber. The wolf cub ate its meat raw, but it spoke as a man would speak, in the language of men and the gods, and it was proud. The little beast was called Fenrir. It too was growing fast. One day it was the size of a wolf, the next the size of a cave bear, then the size of a great elk. The gods were intimidated by it, all except Tyr. He still played with it and romped with it, and he alone fed the wolf its meat every day. And each day the beast ate more than the day before, and each day it grew and it became fiercer and stronger. Odin watched the wolf child grow with foreboding, for in his dreams the wolf had been there at the end of everything, and the last things Odin had seen in any of his dreams of the future were the topaz eyes and the sharp white teeth of Fenris wolf. The gods had a council and resolved at that council that they would bind Fenrir. They crafted heavy chains and shackles in the forges of the gods, and they carried the shackles to Fenrir. "Here," said the gods, as if suggesting a new game. "You have grown so fast, Fenrir. It is time to test your strength. We have here the heaviest chains and shackles. Do you think you can break them?" "I think I can," said Fenris Wolf. "Bind me." The gods wrapped the huge chains around Fenrir and shackled his paws. He waited motionless while they did this. The gods smiled at each other as if they chained the enormous wolf. "No!" shouted Thor. Fenrir strained and stretched the muscles of his legs, and the chains snapped like dry twigs. The great wolf howled to the moon, a howl of triumph and joy. "I broke your chains," he said. "Do not forget this." "We will not forget," said the gods. The next day, Tyr went to take the wolf his meat. "I broke the fetters," said Fenrir. "I broke them easily." "You did," said Tyr. "Do you think they will test me again? I grow, and I grow stronger with every day." "They will test you again. I would wager my right hand on it," said Tyr. The wolf was still growing, and the gods were in the smithies, forging a new set of chains. Each link in the chains was too heavy for a normal man to lift. The metal of the chains was the strongest metal that the gods could find, iron from the earth mixed with iron that had fallen from the sky. They called these chains Dromi. The gods hauled the chains to where Fenrir slept. The wolf opened his eyes. "Again?" he said. "If you can escape from these chains," said the gods, "then your renown and your strength will be known to all the worlds. Glory will be yours. If chains like this cannot hold you, then your strength will be greater than that of any gods or the giants." Fenrir nodded at this, and looked at the chains called Dromi, bigger than any chains had ever been, stronger than the strongest of bonds. "There is no glory without danger," said the wolf after some moments. "I believe I can break these bindings. Chain me up." They chained him. The great wolf stretched and strained, but the chains held. The gods looked at each other, and there was the beginning of triumph in their eyes. But now the huge wolf began to twist and to writhe, to kick out his legs and strain in every muscle and every sinew. His eyes flashed, and his teeth flashed, and his jaws foamed. He growled as he writhed. He struggled with all his might. The gods moved back involuntarily, and it was good that they did so, for the chains fractured and then broke with such violence that the pieces were thrown far into the air, and for years to come, the gods would find lumps of shattered shackles embedded into the sides of huge trees or the sides of mountains. Yes! Shouted Fenrir, and howled in his victory like a wolf and like a man. The gods who had watched the struggle did not seem, the wolf observed, to delight in his victory. Not even tear. Fenrir, Loki's child, brooded on this, and on other matters. And Fenris Wolf grew hunger and hungrier, or rather, sorry, grew huger and hungrier with each day that passed. Odin brooded and he pondered and he thought. All the wisdom of Mimir's well was his, and the wisdom he had gained from hanging from the world tree, a sacrifice to himself. At last, he called the light elf Skirnir, Frey's messenger, to his side, and he described the chain called Gleipnir. Skirnir rode his horse across the rainbow bridge to Svartalfheim, with instructions to the dwarfs for how to create a chain unlike anything ever made before. The dwarfs listened to Skirnir describe the commission, and they shivered, and they named their price. Skirnir agreed, and had been instructed as he had been instructed to do so by Odin. Although the dwarfs' price was high, the dwarfs gathered the ingredients they would need to make Gleipnir. These were the 6 things the dwarfs gathered. For firstly, the footsteps of a cat. For secondly, the beard of a woman. For thirdly, the roots of a mountain. For fourthly, the sinews of a bear. For fifthly, the breath of a fish. For sixth and lastly, the spittle of a beard. Each of these things was used to make Gleipnir. You say you have not seen these things? Of course you have not. The dwarfs used them in their crafting. When the dwarfs had finished their crafting, they gave Skirnir a wooden box. Inside the box was something that looked like a long, silken ribbon, smooth and soft to the touch. It was almost transparent and weighed next to nothing. Skirnir rode to Asgard with his box at his side. He arrived late in the evening after the sun had set. He showed the gods what he had brought back from the workshop of the dwarves, and they were amazed to see it. The gods went together to the shores of the Black Lake, and they called Fenrir by name. He came at a run, as a dog will come when it is called, and the gods marveled to see how big he was and how powerful. "What's happening?" asked the wolf. "We have obtained the strongest bond of all," they told him. "Not even you will be able to break it." The wolf puffed himself up. "I can burst any chains," he told them proudly. Odin opened his hand to display Gleipnir. It shimmered in the moonlight. "That?" said the wolf. "That is nothing." The gods pulled on it to show him how strong it was. "We cannot break it," they told him. The wolf squinted at the silken band that they held between them, glimmering like a snail's trail or the moonlight on the waves, and he turned away, uninterested. "No," he said. "Bring me real chains, real fetters, heavy ones, huge ones, and let me show my strength." "This is Gleipnir," said Odin. "It is stronger than any chains or fetters. Are you scared, Fenrir?" "Scared? Not at all. But what happens if I break a thin ribbon like that? Do you think I will get renown and fame, that people will gather and say, 'Do you know how strong and powerful Fenris Wolf is? He is so powerful that he broke a silken ribbon.' There will be no glory for me in breaking Gleipnir." "You are scared," said Odin. The great beast sniffed the air. "I sense treachery and trickery," said the wolf, his amber eyes flashing in the moonlight. And although I think your Gleipnir may only be a ribbon, I will not consent to be tied up by it." You who broke the strongest, biggest chains that ever were, you are scared by this band?" said Thor. "I am scared of nothing," growled the wolf. "I think it is rather that you little creatures are scared of me." Odin scratched his bearded chin. "You are not stupid, Fenrir. There is no treachery here, but I understand your reluctance. It would take a brave warrior to consent to be tied up with bonds he could not break. I assure you, as the father of the gods, that if you cannot break a band like this, a veritable silken ribbon, as you say, then we gods will have no reason to be afraid of you, and we will set you free and let you go your own way. A long growl from the wolf.
You lie, Allfather. You lie in the way that some folk breathe. If you were to tie me up in bonds I could not escape from, then I do not believe you would free me. I think you would leave me here. I think you plan to abandon me and to betray me. I do not consent to have that ribbon placed on me.
Fine words, and brave words, said Odin. Words to cover your fear at being proved a coward, Fenris Wolf. You are afraid to be tied with this silken ribbon. No need for more explanations. The wolf's tongue lolled from his mouth, and he laughed then, showing sharp teeth the size of a man's arm.
Rather than question my courage, I challenge you to prove there is no trickery here. You can tie me up if one of you will place his hand in my mouth. I will gently close my teeth upon it, but I will not bite down. If there is no treachery afoot, I will open my mouth when I have escaped the ribbon, or when you have freed me, and his hand will be unharmed. There. I swear, if I have a hand in my mouth, you can tie me with your ribbon. So, whose hand will it be?
The gods looked at each other. Balder looked at Thor. Heimdall looked at Odin. Honir looked at Frey, but none of them made a move. Then Tyr, Odin's son, sighed, and stepped forward and raised his right hand. I will put my hand in your mouth, Fenrir, said Tyr. Fenrir lay on his side, and Tyr put his right hand into Fenrir's mouth, just as he had done when Fenrir was a puppy and they had played together. Fenrir closed his teeth gently until they held Tyr's hand at the wrist without breaking the skin, and he closed his eyes. The gods bound him with Gleipnir. A shimmering snail's trail wrapped the enormous wolf, tying his legs, rendering him immobile. There, said Odin. Now, Fenris Wolf, break your bonds. Show us all how powerful you are. The wolf stretched and struggled. It pushed and strained every nerve and muscle to snap the ribbon that bound it. But with every struggle, the task seemed harder. And with every strain, the glimmering ribbon became stronger. At first, the gods snickered. Then, the gods chuckled. Finally, when they were certain that the beast had been immobilized and that they were in no danger, the gods laughed. Only Tyr was silent. He did not laugh. He could feel the sharpness of Fenris Wolf's teeth against his wrist, and the wetness and warmth of Fenris Wolf's tongue against his palm and his fingers. Fenris stopped struggling. He lay there, unmoving. If the gods were going to free him, they would do it now. But the gods only laughed harder. Thor's booming guffaws, each louder than a thunderclap, mingled with Odin's dry laughter, with Balder's bell-like laughter. Fenrir looked at Tyr. Tyr looked at him bravely. Then Tyr closed his eyes and nodded. Do it, he whispered. Fenrir bit down on Tyr's wrist. Tyr made no sound. He simply wrapped his left hand around the stump of his right and squeezed it as hard as he could to slow the spurt of blood to an ooze. Fenrir watched the gods take one end of Gleipnir and thread it through a stone as big as a mountain and fasten it under the ground. Then he watched as they took another rock and used it to hammer the stone deeper into the ground than the deepest ocean.
Treacherous Odin, called the wolf. If you had not lied to me, I would have been a friend to the gods. But your fear has betrayed you. I will kill you, father of the gods. I will wait until the end of all things, and I will eat the sun, and I will eat the moon, but I will take the most pleasure in killing you.
The gods were careful not to get within reach of Fenrir's jaws, but as they were driving the rock deeper, Fenrir twisted and snapped at them. The god nearest him, with presence of mind, thrust his sword into the roof of Fenris's mouth. The hilt of the sword jammed in the wolf's lower jaw, wedging the jaw open and preventing it from ever closing. The wolf growled inarticulately, and saliva poured from its mouth, forming a river. If you did not know it was a wolf, you might have thought it was a small mountain, with a river flowing from a cave mouth. The gods left that place where the river of saliva flowed down into the dark lake, and they did not speak, but once they were far enough away, they laughed some more, and clapped each other on the back, and smiled the huge smiles of those who believe they have done something very clever indeed. Tyr did not smile, and he did not laugh. He bound the stump of his wrist tightly with a cloth, and he walked beside the gods back to Asgard, and he kept his own counsel. These, then, were the children of Loki. There's that story. Another fun one. Yeah. Poor Fenrir. If you read Norse mythology, you'll find that a lot of it is, a lot of things are preventable. But, as is, a case in many of these kind of stories, a prophecy, well rather, the desire to avoid a prophecy fulfills the prophecy all the same. A moment to reflect on that story, since some people are quite saddened. I think we will save the story of Death of Balder for later. It is a long one. It's a good, sad story, but it is quite long. We can still tell it if that's what most people want. It's still on the table. Going forward, we can tell a couple more stories. A couple more from the Norse book, and if we want, we can close off this campfire session with something a bit more chilling. Not Norse. A bit of a spooky tale. Now, you say do whatever I want, but what I want is for you guys to have some say in what stories you want to hear. After all, I am entertaining you. So, throw out what you would like to hear from Norse. We still have the stories of the creation of Mjolnir. For Norse, actually, yeah, we have if we want some more lighthearted ones after all that sadness. We have the Treasures of the Gods, the Master Builder, Thor's. Nah, that one's not. That one. I mean, that one's kind of neutral. So I mean, yeah. If you guys only want, a little more lighthearted. Oh, we're gonna end with the spooks. Don't worry. We are going to end with the spooky story. Don't you worry. So it's rather up to you guys. Do you guys want the sad story of Baldur's death? The Master Builder, not from the Lego movie. This is the story of the Wall of Asgard. Or do you guys want to hear the story of the creation of Mjolnir, otherwise known as the story of how Loki gets in a lot of trouble all the time? It's up to you guys. What do you want? Let's bring the music down just a little bit while we wait to decide. Bring back some of that nice, nice chill, fun music for the interim. I'd like to take a moment between the stories just to thank you guys once again for staying with us throughout this amazing, incredible, fun summer it has been here at Camp Streamix. It's been a real pleasure and real delight entertaining you guys every week, every day even. Just, it's been a good time. And all of you have been such a wonderful, wonderful group. I want to remind each and every one of you that, you know, you guys are important. You guys are amazing and creative and wonderful, and we here at Internet Remix love all of you guys. So, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you guys so much. And remember that you are loved, and you're important, and the world is a much brighter place for having you in it. So, thank you for being here. Just think you guys need a reminder sometimes. But yeah. And whether or not Team Annihilation pulls through in the end, which it most likely won't, which is okay. It's been a fun summer, and whichever team wins, they deserved it. And it's been a hard, fun competition, but at the end of the day, it's all been for the sake of making fun stories to tell after camp has gone away. And I hope that you have really, so far, enjoyed our little campfire stories session. It's not over yet, but it is, I hope you guys have enjoyed it. It's a fun little idea that I think would be a lot more fun to continue in various different ways going forward. Something to think about nonetheless. Let's just take a moment to, while we're figuring out what stories we want to tell next, to just sit here, listen to the fire, listen to the music, and just kick back for a moment. It is a beautiful night. A hot one, but a beautiful nonetheless. And let's just relax. We'll be right back. And we're back. Now that we've taken some time, we've read a few stories, what do you guys want to hear next? We've had time to reflect on which one you want to hear next. For those of you who want something a bit more sad, a little bit, and it's a bit of a long one, but if, you know, you get to decide. For those of you who want a sadder story, we have The Death of Balder. If you want something a bit more lighthearted, we have the story of how Mjolnir was crafted, which is a fun little story. And then we also have, well, anything else. Thank you to everyone who has donated tonight. You're all lovely, lovely people. So, I'd love to see a quick show of hands from our fellow campers. Which we'd like to hear. If I can get what is ever the popular vote, we'll do that. Or we can just read the Mjolnir story. Alright, got some hands from Mjolnir. Scream for 12 hours straight. Yes. Thank you, Phil. You rambunctious little lad. I will not do that, and we can just say we did. Because what happens at Camp Streamix stays at Camp Streamix. So, looks like we have Camper Phil with us here. Oh, we got some hands for something more depressing. Got some Balder votes. Mjolnir, please. I can abide. I'm happy to. Well, it looks like the popular vote is for the Mjolnir story. Also, welcome and hello to everyone who is joining us right now or within the last bit of time. We here at Camp Streamix are just throwing down some fun little stories as our summer of fun comes to a close. So, alright, it looks like we're going to be telling the story of Mjolnir, which I'm happy to do. And just in time, because our fun, chill music is ending. Good timing. And we can throw on some phenomenally fun Norse music again and tell the story. I'm gonna flip to the page, and then after we read this story, we are going to move to the conclusion for the evening, which is as we segue from this summer of streaming fun here at Camp Streamix, we move into the later months and slowly but surely transition into fall. Now, what we will be doing, I cannot say. But things will get spookier as time goes on. So I think it fitting, especially for Team Annihilation, to end the evening with a chilling tale. Something that'll haunt you to your dreams and hopefully not give you nightmares, but all the same, hopefully spooky a bit. To get you in the mindset of things to come. We'll wait a minute for more campers to file in, but it'll be fun. All will be revealed in due time. one thing I can promise you guys is that Tomb of Annihilation is not going anywhere after the camp has ended. There is a lot left of that story, so don't worry. That will be continuing onward. So it's don't worry. Whether or not we take a break, it'll continue as per the normal schedule. Oop. Well, I think we're all ready to hear the story of the treasures of the gods. I know I am. To my understanding, fallen empires will continue as usual. Don't quote me on that, though. This is the story of the treasures of the gods. Thor's wife was the beautiful Sif. She was of the Aesir. Thor loved her for herself and for her blue eyes and her pale skin, her red lips and her smile, and he loved her long, long hair, the color of a field of barley at the end of summer. Thor woke and stirred her sleeping. Rather to say, he stared at sleeping Sif. He scratched his beard, then he tapped his wife with a huge hand. "What happened to you?" he asked. She opened her eyes, the color of the summer sky.
"What are you talking about?"
she asked, and then she moved her head and looked puzzled. Her fingers reached up to her bare pink scalp and touched it, exploring it tentatively. She looked at Thor, horrified.
"My hair,"
was all she said. Thor nodded. "It's gone," he said. "He has left you bald."
"He?"
asked Sif. Thor said nothing. He strapped on his belt of power, Megingjord, which doubled his enormous strength. "Loki," he said. "Loki has done this."
"Why do you say that?"
said Sif, touching her bald head frantically, as if the fluttering touch of her fingers would make her hair return. "Because," said Thor, "when something goes wrong, the first thing I always think is, it is Loki's fault. It saves a lot of time." Thor found Loki's door locked, so he pushed through it, leaving it in pieces. He picked Loki up and said only, "Why?" "Why what?" Loki's face was the picture of perfect innocence. "Sif's hair, my wife's golden hair. It was so beautiful. Why did you cut it off?" 100 expressions chased across Loki's face. Cunning and shiftiness, truculence and confusion. Thor shook Loki hard. Loki looked down and did his best to appear ashamed. "It was funny. I was drunk." Thor's brow furrowed. "Sif's hair was her glory. People will think that her head was shaved for punishment, that she did something she should not have done, did it with someone she should not have." "Well, yes, there is that," said Loki. "They will probably think that, and unfortunately, given that I took her hair from the roots, she will go through the rest of her life completely bald." "No, she won't." Thor looked up at Loki, whom he was now holding far above his head with a face like thunder. "I am afraid she will, but there are always hats and scarves." "She won't go through life bald," said Thor. "Because, Loki Lothay's son, if you do not put her hair back right now, I am going to break every single bone in your body, each and every one of them. And if her hair does not grow properly, I will come back and break every bone in your body again and again. If I do it every day, I'll soon get really good at it." He carried on, sounding slightly more cheerful. "No!" said Loki.
I can't put her hair back. It doesn't work like that. Today, mused Thor, it will probably take me about an hour to break every bone in your body. But I bet with practice, I could get it down to about 15 minutes. It will be interesting to find out. He started to break the first bone. Dwarves! Shrieked Loki. Pardon? Dwarves! They can make anything. They could make golden hair for Sif, hair that would bond with her scalp and grow normally. Perfect golden hair. They could do it. I swear they could. Then, said Thor, you had better go and talk to them. And he dropped Loki from high above his head onto the floor. Loki clambered to his feet and hurried away before Thor could break any more bones. He put on his shoes that let him travel through the sky, and he went to Svartalfheim, where the dwarfs have their workshops. The most ingenious craftsmen of them all, he decided, were the 3 dwarfs known as the Sons of Ivaldi. Loki went to their underground forge. Hello, Sons of Ivaldi. I have asked around, and the people here tell me that Brock and Eitri, the brother, are the greatest dwarf craftsmen that are or ever have been, said Loki. No, said one of the Sons of Ivaldi. It's us. We are the greatest craftsmen there are. I am assured that Brock and Eitri can make treasures as good as those you can. Lies, said the tallest of the Sons of Ivaldi. I wouldn't trust those fumble-fingered incompetents to shoe a horse. The smallest and the wisest of the Sons of Ivaldi simply shrugged. Whatever they make, we could do better. I hear that they've challenged you, said Loki. 3 treasures. The gods of the Aesir will judge who made the best treasure. Oh, and by the way, one of the treasures you make needs to be hair. Ever-growing perfect golden hair. We can do that, said one of the Sons of Ivaldi. Even Loki could barely tell them apart. Loki went across the mountain to see the dwarf called Brock, at the workshop he shared with his brother, Eitri. Ivaldi's sons are making 3 treasures as gifts for the gods of Asgard, said Loki. The gods are going to judge the treasures. Ivaldi's sons want me to tell you that they are certain you and your brother Eitri can't make anything as good as they can. They called you fumble-fingered incompetents. Brock was no fool. This smells extremely fishy to me, Loki, he said. Are you sure this isn't your doing? Stirring up trouble between Eitri and me and Ivaldi's boys seems like the sort of thing you do. Loki looked as guileless as he could, which was amazingly guileless. Nothing to do with me, he said innocently. I just thought you should know. And you have no personal stake in this? Asked Brock. None whatsoever. Brock nodded and looked up at Loki. Brock's brother Eitri was the great craftsman, but Brock was the smarter of the two, and the more determined. Well, then we'll be happy to take on the Sons of Ivaldi in a test of skill to be judged by the gods. Because I have no doubt that Eitri can forge better and craftier things than Ivaldi's lot. But let's make this personal, Loki, eh? What do you have in mind? Asked Loki. Your head, said Brock. If we win this contest, we get your head, Loki. There's lots of things going on in that head of yours, and I have no doubt Eitri could make a wonderful device out of it. A thinking machine, perhaps. Or an inkwell. Loki kept smiling, but he scowled on the inside. The day had started out so well. Still, he simply had to ensure that Eitri and Brock lost the contest. The gods would still get 6 wonderful things from the dwarfs, and Sif would get her golden hair. He could do that. He was Loki. Of course, he said. My head. No problem. Across the mountain, the Sons of Ivaldi were making their treasures. Loki was not worried about them. But he needed to make sure that Brock and Eitri could not possibly win. Brock and Eitri entered the forge. It was dark in there, lit by the orange glow of burning charcoal. Eitri took a pigskin from a shelf and placed it onto the forge. I've been keeping this pigskin for something like this, he said.
Brock just nodded.
Right, said Eitri. You work the bellows, Brock. Just keep pumping them. I need this hot, and I need it consistently hot, otherwise it won't work. Pump, pump.
Brock began to pump the bellows, sending a stream of oxygen-rich air into the heart of the forge, heating everything up. He had done it many times before. Eitri watched until he was satisfied that it would all be to his liking. Eitri left to work on his creation outside the forge. As he opened the door to go out, a large black insect flew in. It was not a horsefly, and it was not a deerfly. It was bigger than either. It flew in and circled the room in a malicious way. Brock could hear the sound of Eitri's hammer outside the forge, and the sounds of filing and twisting, of shaping and banging. The large black fly, it was the biggest, blackest fly you have ever seen, landed on the back of Brock's hand. Both of Brock's hands were on the bellows. He did not stop pumping to swat at the fly. The fly bit Brock hard on the back of the hand. Brock kept pumping. The door opened and Eitri came in and carefully pulled the work from the forge. It appeared to be a huge boar with bristles of gleaming gold.
Good work, said Eitri. A fraction of a degree warmer or cooler, and the whole thing would have been a waste of our time. Good work to you too, said Brock.
The black fly, up on the corner of the ceiling, seethed with resentment and irritation. Eitri took a block of gold and placed it on the forge.
Right, he said. This next one will impress them. When I call, start pumping the bellows, and whatever happens, do not slow down or speed up or stop. There's fiddly work involved.
Got it, said Brock. Eitri left the room and began to work. Brock waited until he heard Eitri's call, and he started to pump the bellows. The black fly circled the room thoughtfully, then landed on Brock's neck. The insect stepped aside daintily to avoid a rivulet of sweat, for the air was hot and close in the forge. It bit Brock's neck as hard as it could. Scarlet blood joined the sweat on Brock's neck, but the dwarf did not stop pumping. Eitri returned. He removed a white-hot arm ring from the forge. He dropped it into the stone cooling pool in the forge to quench it. There was a cloud of steam as the arm ring fell into the water. The ring cooled, moving rapidly to orange, to red-hot, and then, as it cooled, to gold.
It's called Draupnir, said Eitri.
The Draper? That's a funny name for a ring,
said Brock. Not for this one, said Eitri, and he explained to Brock what was so very special about the arm ring. Now, said Eitri, there's something I've had in mind to make for a very long time now. My masterwork. But it's even trickier than the other two. So, what you have to do is...
Pump and don't stop pumping, said Brock.
That's right, said Eitri. Even more than before. Do not change your pace, or the whole thing will be ruined.
Eitri picked up an ingot of pig iron, bigger than any ingot that the black fly, who was Loki, had ever seen before, and he hefted it into the forge. He left the room and called out to Brock to begin pumping. Brock began to pump, and the sound of Eitri's hammers began as Eitri pulled and shaped and welded and joined. Loki, in fly shape, decided that there was no more time for subtlety. Eitri's masterpiece would be something that would impress the gods, and if the gods were impressed enough, then he would lose his head. Loki landed between Brock's eyes and started to bite the dwarf's eyelids. The dwarf continued to pump, his eyes stinging. Loki bit deeper, harder, more desperately. Now blood ran from the dwarf's eyelids into his eyes and down his face, blinding him. Brock squinted and shook his head, trying to dislodge the fly. He jerked his head from side to side. He contorted his mouth and tried blowing air up at the fly. It was no good. The fly continued to bite, and the dwarf could see nothing but blood. A sharp pain filled his head. Brock counted, and at the bottom of the downstroke, he whipped one hand from the bellows and swiped at the fly with such speed and such strength that Loki barely escaped with his life. Brock grabbed the bellows once again and continued to pump. "Enough!" called Eitri. The black fly flew unsteadily about the room. Eitri opened the door, allowing the fly to escape. Eitri looked at his brother with disappointment. Brock's face was a mess of blood and sweat. "I don't know what you were playing at that time," said Eitri, "but you came close to ruining everything. The temperature was all over the place at the end, and it's nowhere near as impressive as I'd hope. We'll just have to see." Loki, in Loki shape, strolled in through the open door. "So, all ready for the contest?" he asked. "Brock can go to Asgard and present my gifts to the gods and cut off your head," said Eitri. "I like it best here at my forge, making things." Brock stared at Loki through swollen eyelids.
I'm looking forward to cutting off your head, said Brock. It got personal.
In Asgard, 3 gods sat behind their thrones. One-eyed Odin the Allfather, red-bearded Thor of the Thunders, and handsome Frey of the Summer's Harvest. They would be the judges. Loki stood before them, beside the 3 almost identical sons of Ivaldi. Brock, black-bearded and brooding, was there alone, standing to one side, the things he had brought hidden beneath sheets.
"So," said Odin, "what are we judging?"
"Treasures," said Loki. "The sons of Ivaldi have made gifts for you, great Odin, and for Thor, and for Frey, and so have Eitri and Brock. It is up to you to decide which of the 6 things is the finest treasure. I myself will show you the gifts made by the sons of Ivaldi." He presented Odin with a spear called Gungnir. It was a beautiful spear, carved with intricate runes. "It will penetrate anything, and when you throw it, it will always find its mark," said Loki. Odin had but one eye after all, and sometimes his aim could be less than perfect. And just as important, an oath taken on this spear is unbreakable. Odin hefted the spear.
"It is very fine,"
was all he said. "And here," Loki said proudly, "is a flowing head of golden hair, made of real gold. It will attach itself to the head of the person who needs it, and grow and behave in every way as if it were real hair. 100,000 strands of gold."
"I will test it," said Thor. "Sif, come here."
Sif rose and came to the front, her head covered. She removed her headscarf. The gods gasped when they saw Sif's naked head, bald and pink, and then she carefully placed the dwarf's golden wig on her head and shook her hair. They watched as the base of the wig joined itself to her scalp, and then Sif stood in the front of them, even more radiant and beautiful than before.
"Impressive," said Thor. "Good job."
Sif tossed her golden hair and walked out of the hall into the sunlight to show her new hair to her friends. The last of the sons of Ivaldi's remarkable gifts was small and folded like cloth. This cloth Loki placed in front of Frey.
"What is it? It looks like a silk scarf," said Frey, unimpressed.
"It does," said Loki, "but if you unfold it, you will discover it is a ship called Skidbladnir. It will always have a fair wind wherever it goes, and although it is huge, the biggest ship you can imagine, it will fold up as you see like a cloth, so you can put it in your pouch." Frey was impressed, and Loki was relieved. They were 3 excellent gifts. Now it was Brock's turn. His eyelids were red and swollen, and there was a huge insect bite on the side of his neck. Loki thought Brock looked entirely too cocky, especially given the remarkable things Ivaldi's sons had made. Brock took the golden arm ring and placed it in front of Odin on his high throne.
"This arm ring is called Dropnir," said Brock, "because every 9th night, 8 gold arm rings of equal beauty will drip from it. You can reward people with them, or store them, and your wealth will increase."
Odin examined the arm ring, then pushed it onto his arm, up high on his biceps. It gleamed there.
It is very fine,
he said. Loki recalled that Odin had said the same thing about the spear. Brock walked over to Frey. He raised a cloth and revealed a huge boar with bristles made of gold.
This is a boar my brother made for you to pull your chariot, said Brock. It will race across the sky and over the sea faster than the fastest horse. There will never be a night so dark that its golden bristles will not give light and let you see what you are doing. It will never tire and will never fail you. It is called Gullinbursti, and the golden bristled one.
Frey looked impressed. Still, thought Loki, the magical ship that folded up like a cloth was every bit as impressive as an unstoppable war that shone in the dark. Loki's head was quite safe, and the last gift Brock had to present was the one Loki knew he had already managed to sabotage. From beneath the cloth, Brock produced a hammer and placed it in front of Thor. Thor looked at it and sniffed.
The handle is rather short,
he said. Brock nodded.
Yes, he said. That's my fault. I was working the bellows. But before you dismiss it, let me tell you about what makes this hammer unique. It's called Mjolnir, the Lightning Maker. First of all, it's unbreakable. Doesn't matter how hard you hit something with it, the hammer will always be undamaged.
Thor looked interested. He had already broken a great many weapons over the years, normally by hitting things with them.
If you throw the hammer, it will never miss what you throw it at.
Thor looked even more interested. He had lost a number of otherwise excellent weapons by throwing them at things that irritated him and missing, and he had watched too many weapons he had thrown disappear into the distance, never to be seen again.
No matter how hard or fast or far you throw it, it will always return to your hand.
Thor was now actually smiling. And the Thunder God did not often smile.
You can change the size of the hammer. It will grow, and it will also shrink down so small that if you wish, you can hide it inside your shirt.
Thor clapped his hands together in delight, and thunder echoed across Asgard.
And yet, as you have observed, concluded Brock sadly, the handle of the hammer is indeed too short. This is my fault. I failed to keep the bellows blowing while my brother Eitri was forging it.
The shortness of the handle is a minor cosmetic problem, said Thor. The hammer will protect us from the frost giants. This is the finest gift I have ever seen. It will protect Asgard. It will protect all of us, said Odin with approval. If I were a giant, I would be very afraid of Thor if he had that hammer, said Frey.
Yes, it's an excellent hammer, but Thor, what about the hair? Sif's beautiful new golden hair, asked Loki, slightly desperately.
What? Oh, yes, my wife has very nice hair, said Thor. Now, show me how to make the hammer grow and shrink, Brock. Thor's hammer is better even than my wonderful spear and my excellent arm ring, said Odin, nodding.
The hammer is greater and more impressive than my ship and my boar, admitted Frey. It will keep the gods of Asgard safe. The gods clapped Brock on the back and told him that he and Eitri had made the finest gifts that they had ever been given.
Good to know, said Brock. He turned to Loki. So, said Brock, I get to cut off your head, Laufey's son, and take it back with me. Eitri will be so pleased. We can turn it into something useful.
I will ransom my head, said Loki. I have treasures that I can give you.
Eitri and I already have all the treasures we need, said Brock. We make treasures. No, Loki, I want your head.
Loki thought for a moment, then said, Then you can have it if you can catch me. And Loki leapt high into the air and ran off far above their heads. In moments, he was gone. Brock looked at Thor.
Can you catch him?
Thor shrugged.
I really shouldn't, he said. But then, I would very much like to try out the hammer.
In moments, Thor returned, holding Loki tightly. Loki was glaring with impotent fury. The dwarf Brock took out his knife.
Come here, Loki, he said. I am going to cut off your head.
Of course, said Loki. You can, of course, cut off my head. But, and I appeal to mighty Odin here, if you cut off any of my neck, you are violating the terms of our agreement, which promised you my head, and my head only. Odin inclined his head.
Loki is right. You have no right to cut his neck.
Brock was irritated.
But I can't cut off his head without cutting his neck, he said.
Loki looked pleased with himself. You see, he said, if people thought through the exactness of their words, they would not dare to take on Loki, the wisest, the cleverest, the trickiest, the most intelligent, the best looking. Brock whispered a suggestion to Odin.
That would be fair,
agreed Odin. Brock produced a strip of leather and a knife. He wrapped the leather around Loki's mouth. Brock tried to pierce the leather with the tip of the knife blade.
It's not working, said Brock. My knife isn't cutting you.
I might have wisely arranged for protection from knife blades, said Loki modestly, just in case the whole "you can't cut my neck" ploy did not work. I am afraid no knife blade can cut me. Brock grunted and produced an awl, a pointed spike used in leatherwork, as he jabbed it through the leather, punching holes through Loki's lips. Then he took a strong thread and sewed Loki's lips together with it. Brock walked away, leaving Loki with his mouth sewn up tight, unable to complain. For Loki, the pain of being unable to talk hurt even more than the pain of having his lips stitched into the leather. So now you know. That is how the gods got their greatest treasures. It was Loki's fault. Even Thor's hammer was Loki's fault. That was the thing about Loki. You resented him even when you were at your most grateful, and you were grateful to him even when you hated him most. For those of you watching who have technical difficulties, I will confirm that this is going on YouTube, so you can always catch the video of this later on. I've had a very fun time sitting here telling you all these fun little Norse myths and legends, and there are certainly more that came from. There is, of course, the death of Balder, which we will tell one day. I have a feeling that I will like doing these reading streams a bit more often. They're fun, they're calming, and they're fun. Guys, that's just really it. They're fun for me, and I hope they're fun for you. Now, I am. These are all coming from Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman, which is a wonderful, amazing, lovely book, and I highly recommend you pick it up to read it for yourself, because Neil's writing is just absolutely amazing. There might be different themes for these campfire stories. There are many different stories I can read from. And, well, they are campfire stories, for they are, you know, this is Camp Streamix, and it's the summer. Going forward, they might be the Internet Remix Book Club, for all we know. Time will tell. Time will tell, indeed. We're going to take another moment here between stories to just chill again. We might do these as like fireside chats, in a manner of speaking. As we move on to the final story of our evening, I would like to remind you campers that if you are easily scared or not in the mood to be spooked, that you turn away now. This story is not particularly explicit or horrifying, but it is spooky all the same. Part of a longer series, and I will read the installments as we go along. It began as a bit of an internet creepypasta, although not a creepypasta. This was posted on No Sleep, the Reddit horror story forum, many years ago. Some of you might know it by its published title, Pen Pal. I will be reading the first entry from that series, known simply as Footsteps. You're more than welcome to read the entire series by yourself, but as I go along, I'll just take my own pace with it. I would be surprised if some of you haven't heard of Pen Pal before. It was quite popular when it first came out, and it gained a lot of traction, to say the least. So much traction that the writer actually published it as a full novel. That novel I just happen to own, and I will be reading from that novel today. I will not be treating this as reading a book. I'll be treating this as reading from one story. If you want a full audiobook or book club, well, that's a different stream entirely. One that I assume we might do someday. It might be fun. I always encourage reading, and for those of you out there who might have trouble reading, whether it be dyslexia or something else entirely, I am nothing but an advocate for new and interesting ways to expose people to some really, really enjoyable stories out there. It's part of the reason why I do audiobooks. Now then, let's move in here in a moment to this creepy, creepy story. We'll be right back. Footsteps by Dathan Auerbach. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a 6-year-old boy, the muffled, rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor, and so as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice and extremely rural neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in. My mother and I were 2 of these people. Those that spend any amount of time driving on interstate highways will see half houses traveling alongside them. It's an odd sight if you let yourself think about it. 2 halves of a house built somewhere miles away from where it becomes a home. Everything about those structures has a feeling of impermanence. The wood that forms them is cut where it isn't used and assembled where it doesn't stay. The most permanent things about those houses are the concrete support on columns that they rest on. But even those seem transitory in a way. My mother and I lived in one of these houses, but she took good care of it. As a kid, I always thought our house was quite nice. As I sit here and think about my old home and all the things in it, an amusing and pleasant conflict builds in my mind. I know now that we're poor, but had you asked me then, I would have had no idea what could have prompted the question. My mother must have had so little money to spend, but I never remember her saying the words that tend to become the mantra of some parents when they try to subdue their children's eager shopping. We can't afford it. I don't remember wanting for much. I even had a bunk bed despite being an only child. I'm sure that this is the case for many children in low-income homes, but as a boy, despite the incongruity, I thought my home was as close to a palace as one could hope for. To me, the support columns under the house didn't represent what the house actually was, an imported structure on a makeshift foundation, but what it could be. I remember asking my mother if we could make the columns taller so that our house would tower over all the others. Part of my love for the house stemmed from my general love for the surrounding area. The neighborhood itself was relatively large in proportion to the town itself. Small towns lack many of the luxuries of larger towns or cities. What few stores there are close early. Traveling agents don't stop there because they probably missed your small dot on the map. And if there aren't many police or hospitals at your disposal. But to a kid, these things don't matter because small towns often provide a luxury that can't be found in larger, more convenient or populated places. Freedom. Of course, I had rules to follow. I had a lot of them, in fact, but I didn't notice any of them restricting me because I was allowed to do the one thing a kid in a relatively remote area likes to do: explore. Just a short walk from my back porch was a dense and untamed wilderness that I spent some part of nearly every day surveying. These woods and waterways surrounding the neighborhood were my playground during the day, but at night, as things often do in the mind of a child, they would take on a more sinister feeling. The apparent change in the very nature of the trees and the lake, I think, was mostly my fault. One of my mother's rules was that I could explore the woods on the condition that I would be home before dark. To motivate my speedy return, I would play games in my mind when leaving the woods at dusk. My feet moved more quickly when I imagined that they were carrying me away from ghouls and beasts. When I would dream, the footsteps would belong to these pursuers. Sometimes I'd pretend that a hideous and ravenous wolf was charging through the woods just behind me. I'd imagine what would happen if I stumbled or fell and it caught up with me, but when I concentrated too hard on keeping my balance, it would always seem to ensure that I lost it. Other times I'd convince myself that there was an enormous clutter of spiders descending from the trees above and blanketing the earth behind, and that I was always inches away from being ensnared in a collective web or simply overwhelmed by their numbers and tackled by the sheer weight of their individually weightless bodies. The thing I imagined the most, I think, was that if I didn't make it home before the sun went down, my mother would be gone, that everyone would be gone, and that I'd be all alone. I always made it back home the quickest when I played that game. It didn't take long for these games to become a reflex, and the fear would appear without any effort at all. Some nights I would spill into the house so frantically that it would startle my mother, but this was the winter of the first grade of elementary school, so I tried to compose myself and pretend that I was merely worried about getting home too late. The things I imagined in the woods just before nightfall created a feeling of general uneasiness in me when the sun retired. My home offered refuge from these terrors, but the architecture of my house came to sabotage my feelings of security. The concrete stilts that raised my house above the earth left a void just below the entirety of the floor of my home. Gradually, my mind came to fill this crawl space with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios, and they would consume my thoughts whenever I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining things. This seemed appropriate. This seemed an appropriate accusation given my tactics for making curfew, but I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey blaster once just to placate me, since I insisted that it would help. Of course, it didn't. The footsteps continued that night, but I tried my best to ignore them, just like always. Despite the general eeriness that the games and footsteps would cast over the nighttime neighborhood, my life was a quiet one. I had adventures by myself, or more often, with my best friend Josh. I suppose every kid has their adventures. The only odd or noteworthy events that I can remember happening were the occasions when I would wake up on the bottom bunk despite having gone to sleep on the top. This would only happen every now and again, but it wasn't really that strange since I'd sometimes get up to use the bathroom or get something to drink and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. This would happen frequently enough to remember, but infrequently enough to dismiss. In itself, waking up on the bottom bunk never really bothered me. But one night, toward the end of winter in first grade, I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I had heard the footsteps, but was too far gone to be woken by them. When I awoke, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps, but the feeling of biting cold and violent shivering. As I opened my eyes, the clashing of what I expected to see, what I had nearly always seen when I woke up in a place other than the top bunk, and what I actually saw, frustrated my senses as my mind tried to reconcile my expectations with actuality. I saw, or rather my mind showed me, the red cylindrical bars that supported the mattress of the top bunk, but beyond those, I saw stars. Gradually, the bars melted away and faded from my vision, and I was left with only those floating points of light and the jagged crossing limbs of the tall trees that arched across them high up into the sky. I was in the woods. I shouldn't be here, I thought. The coupling of the woods with darkness was something I had trained myself to avoid. I sat up immediately and tried to make sense of where I was. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right. Though neither did me being in the woods. My eyes were slowly adjusting to the limited light, and gradually the trunks of trees and the shapes of overgrown bushes began to take form. I scanned over the foliage without really focusing on any of it as I searched for something I might recognize, something that might give me some indication of where I was. An unnatural shape caught my eyes, and I looked at it for what felt like a very long time until I could finally discern what it was. About 10 feet in front of me, resting among a mass of tangled sticks and loose leaves, there was a deflated pool float that was shaped like a shark. Even after I understood what it was, I continued looking at it, trying to figure out why it was there. This only added to the surreal feeling, to the point that I was sure that I must be experiencing a dream rather than the world itself. After a while, though, it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up, because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, and I caught a flash of some trampled shrubs that looked like a path, but the woods were thick behind it, so I turned to look elsewhere. I didn't recognize this place. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and I knew them really well. I had only been in them when it was dark once before. I had run through my woods straight to my house and at the last edge of dusk countless times without even having to think about how to get there. There's a big difference between dusk and dark, and as soon as I stood there, taking in all that there was to see in the dim light, it started to creep into my mind much more forcefully that these might not be my woods after all. A shiver that I think was only partially due to the chilled air ran through me, as I wondered how someone was supposed to find his way to a place when he didn't know where he was starting. I took a deep breath and a single step, and felt a shooting pain in my foot. I lifted my leg quickly and reeled off balance, falling back to where I had woken up only moments ago. I moved my eyes from the terrain to my throbbing foot, and saw what felled me. I had stepped on a thorn. It stuck out about an inch only out of the middle of my foot, but it only bled when I quickly tore it out of my skin. I wound my arm back to throw it someplace where it wouldn't pose a danger to me any longer, but as I searched for a safe spot, I realized there wasn't one. By the light of the moon, I could see that the thorns were everywhere. The whole ground was laced with this natural barbed wire. I had been lucky to only step on a single thorn just then, but as this occurred to me, I became conscious of the rest of my body. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine. As a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I searched over my legs and feet with my eyes and hands. No cuts, no scrapes. I didn't have another scratch on me. I wasn't even that dirty. I cried for a little bit and then stood back up. I opened my mouth and filled my 6-year-old lungs to capacity, and just as I was about to scream for help, my breath hitched in my throat as a thought lodged itself powerfully in my mind. What if someone heard me? I held the air tightly in my chest, and stood puzzled by my own question. I needed help. Shouldn't I hope that someone would hear me? All at once, I began to think of the fiends and monsters that I had imagined stalking and chasing me through and out of what might be these woods. I found myself wishing I had never played those games. I let the air escape slowly to give myself a last chance to use it in case I changed my mind and wanted to yell. I didn't. I would have to find my own way. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction and began walking. I walked for what felt like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line, but there was no path to follow. I made sure to course correct when I had to take detours around the tree limbs that were too entwined to move through, or patches of thorns that were too broad to step over. Every time I would make my way past one of these natural obstacles, I would be confronted with a seemingly identical tapestry of foliage, and the feeling of hopelessness would begin to assert itself a little more. I just wanted to see something familiar, and each time the woods appeared particularly thick, I thought I had found my landmark. Making the outer edge of my usual explorations, there was an enormous pile of discarded and decaying Christmas trees that my best friend Josh had found once during a game of hide and seek. Although he had been driven out of its concealing shelter fairly quickly by fire ants, we would return to it many times to trample on the stray and spherical colored ornaments that had been left behind. We had many stories about where the trees had all come from. I assume now that the genesis of the pile was much more ordinary than what we had hypothesized. Whatever the origins, what was left was a tangled mess of still decorated, however sparsely, holiday trees that looked from a distance to be a single colossal Christmas tree. This would be the easiest thing to spot in the woods, but if I found it, I would know where I was. But that was only if these were my woods. As I stepped delicately through the brush, an idea began to form in my mind. If I could climb a tree, I might be able to see my way to the wood's exit. I became less despondent and began searching the canopy for a proper scouting position. None of the trees seemed tall enough, but if I could find one that was, I might be able to see a house. I might even be able to see my house, I thought. I stood still and balanced carefully on my now aching feet. The trees that loomed over me when I had woken up in these woods had been tall, I recalled, but I struggled to remember just how tall they were. What about the branches? I mumbled to myself. I remember seeing branches above me, and if they grew low enough, I knew that I would be able to climb up the tree. If I could find my way back to that spot, I could work my way up the tree and possibly see a way out. but that would mean going back. I shifted on my feet and tried to make the best decision. Turning around, I took a few steps back toward the direction from which I had come, and froze as a phrase echoed in my head. How far can you go into the woods? I hadn't been tortured by this question for well over a year, and I stood there a bit bewildered by the fact that it had suddenly come rushing back into my mind. On an afternoon, toward the beginning of kindergarten, I had come home from exploring a part of the woods that I had never seen before. I was excited to tell my mother how far I had gone, and she seemed, even if she was only humoring me, to be equally excited to hear it. When I had finished describing my journey, she congratulated me and asked if I had finally seen all the woods there were in our neighborhood. I told her that I didn't think so, but that I wanted to. She smiled and she asked, "So, how far can you go into the woods?" This sounded like a challenge, and so I answered confidently, but none of my answers seemed satisfactory to her. Really far, super far, and even all the way were all rejected as viable responses. After each attempt to close the issue, she would just return with the same question, becoming more amused by the minute. At a loss, and wanting to be able to answer her question so that she would stop asking it, I asked the only other authority figure I knew, my teacher. She gave me a quizzical look and asked me what I meant. I didn't even really know what I meant, and so I just repeated the question. She thought for a moment and said, "I don't know. Let's see," as she walked me over to the map that was tacked to our classroom wall. She asked me the name of my street, which I had memorized, and she took a moment to find it before touching my shoulder and holding her finger on a big patch of green. "I think these are your woods," she said. I repeated my question yet again. I told her that my mom had been asking me this question repeatedly. As I told my teacher this, she seemed to realize something and took her finger off the map. She smiled coyly, saying, "I don't know. How far can you go into the woods?" As I stood there in the woods with my arms tucked inside my shirt to avoid the frigid air, I thought about this question and remembered how I came across the answer. This stirred a warm fondness in me that almost made me forget about the reason the question had come back in my mind to begin with. I discovered the answer just a few weeks after I asked my teacher. My grandparents called to chat with my mother and me, and when my mom handed the phone to talk to my grandfather, Pop, I thought I could have a little fun and be on the giving end of the antagonizing for once. Before he could even ask me how I'd been, I charged at him. "Hi, Pop. How far can you go in the woods?" "What? How far can you go in the woods?" I repeated knowingly, although I knew nothing at all.
"Ah, well, I suppose about halfway," he said, snickering.
"What? How come you can go only halfway?" And then, as if he had been waiting for this moment for his entire life, he bellowed,
"Because if I went any further, I'd be coming out."
He began laughing so hard that it transformed into a coughing fit, and he handed the phone off to my grandmother. It took me a while to appreciate the nature of the question and its answer. I had never heard a riddle before, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I would ask that question to dozens of people in the months to follow. Standing there, barefoot in the woods, thinking about this riddle, I found that it wasn't amusing anymore. However, now it was more than just a silly question. I had walked a long way. For all I knew, I couldn't walk any further in. The last tree might be just ahead. If I turned back now, I might be walking back into the woods rather than out of them. I pivoted where I stood and resumed the trajectory that I had adopted when I set out. Everything was eerily quiet as I pressed on. The only noticeable sounds were crickets, cicadas, and the light grinding of leaves under my sore feet. Occasionally, however, I would step too hard on a healthy stick, and its cracking would drive the noisy creatures to silence. I would stand there paralyzed by the sudden hush, and I would hold my breath and listen for sounds I hoped not to hear. When the insects resumed, so would I. Desperate to keep their noise, I trod carefully on the undergrowth, but it was thick, and here and there my foot would press down on a stick just enough to snap it. The bugs would arrest, and so would I. This relationship persisted until the last interlude that I remember. I broke a stick. The insects hushed themselves, but instead of the expected silence, I heard what sounded like an infant crying in the distance. I could feel the blood draining out of my limbs as I listened to this wailing that didn't sound as far in the distance as I wished it to be. I felt a churning in my stomach and a weakness in my legs. Standing completely still and being careful not to make any noise, I waited. But the sound didn't stop. Suddenly, another sound joined the chorus. A large stick snapped just behind me. I panicked. I think now, as an adult, that the sound I heard that night was a cat in either heat or rage, but I had no thoughts in my mind as I ran veering in different directions, taking as much care as I could to avoid big thickets of bushes and collapsed trees. I was paying close attention to where I stepped because my feet were in such bad shape, and I suppose I instinctively wagered that it would be better to move less quickly than not at all. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough attention to where those steps were leading, because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with such despair that I find it difficult to articulate its potency even now. It was the pool float. I was right back where I had woken up. I stood there, dazed, staring at the pool float. It looked oddly familiar to me now that the initial mental haze that had plagued me when I first awoke had dissipated. I wondered if that was because it was the only thing in the woods that I actually recognized, but that didn't seem quite right. I shook it off and attended to what really mattered. I had traveled for what felt like a great distance, but I hadn't really moved at all. This wasn't magic or some supernatural folding of space. I was lost, utterly and completely. Up until that moment, perhaps in an effort to focus on what I could control, I had thought about more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. My feet had not hurt at first, but they were agonized now, and I had made not even an inch of progress. I had been hoping that these were my woods from the time that I had woken in them. I had hoped that I simply didn't recognize them due to the obscuring and distorting darkness. But my optimism had long since disappeared, swallowed like everything else by the engulfing blackness. Had I run in a huge circle around that spot, or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? I realized that even if I set out again on the path I had tried to follow at the outset, there would be no way to make sure I could actually chart the same course. And if I took a completely different course, then I wouldn't have even made progress in terms of scouting the area through my original excursion. And although I had pushed it to the very back of my mind, rhythmically like a metronome, my mother's riddle marched back to the front lines. Its footsteps faint at first, but gradually building in a crescendo that became so loud I could think of nothing else. Into the woods. As this echoed through my thoughts, I suddenly pictured the woods as a vast circle of trees. As I turned on the spot on which I stood and looked around me, a fear crept into my mind that I might be standing at the very edge of a circle, and that whatever direction I picked would just lead me deeper, farther into the woods. As I continued scanning the landscape around me, my eyes fixated on one of the trees that I had seen towering above me when I first woke up. I looked at it dully, the way you gaze at something when you aren't actually seeing it, despite how unshakably fixed your eyes have become, like staring at a wall when you're lost in thought. Slowly, both my eyes and mind regained their focus, and I moved my head up. It was tall. I forced the despair out of myself and made my way to the tree, being careful to avoid the thorns that were blanketing the ground. As I stood on the exposed roots of the tree and looked straight up the height of its trunk, I thought that the tree must surely be tall enough to allow me to see my way out. I reached my hand up and grasped the lowest limb, but as I tightened my grip, my arm began shaking. Trying to steady myself, I moved my other hand up onto the branch, but when I tried to pull myself up, I felt my body protest. I remember thinking that night that it was simply too cold to climb the trees, but I know it wasn't the cold that stopped me. It was fear. I released the branch and looked back to the spot where my night had started. I couldn't see the place. I could still see the place where I had woken up. It was a relatively clear spot in the middle of an otherwise debris-laced ground, as if I had tried to make a snow angel in the dirt and had given up in the middle of the project. It was a strange sight, but not any stranger than the rest of this place. Fully conscious of my feet's condition, I walked back to the small clearing and sat down with my legs crossed. What if there's no way out? I questioned torturously. I was too defeated to feel anything but apathy, and I turned my attention back to the tall trees and the stars above, looking upon it with all listlessness. Tracing my eyes over the stars, I had an epiphany. I had heard so much about explorers navigating the world by sea, traveling to undiscovered lands and building new civilizations. I had learned that they could do this by following the stars, and my spirits rose in a flash as I realized that I might be able to do the same. At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked for it and found the one with the most brilliant shimmer. I followed it. I was careful to keep the star that I picked in my sights at all times. If I reached a point where the trees above obscured it too much or for too long, I redirected myself on a path that avoided them. I ignored every sound that tempted me to whip my body around to confront it, and despite the pain, I surveyed the ground primarily by the feel of my feet rather than the sight of my eyes, knowing that if the star was lost, so too would be my way. Eventually, my surroundings began to look more familiar. A network of fallen trees that I recognized as the ones I had used as balance beams offered my first legitimate sign of hope, though I walked around and not across them at this time. Soon after, I came upon the Christmas tree pile, its scattered ornaments glimmering dimly in the weak moonlight. I gave it a wide berth to avoid the glass shards that might still pepper the ground from the times that my feet, when they were less vulnerable, had pressed down upon the glass balls of holiday flair and crushed them. My nerves were beginning to calm, and when I saw a dirt void called the ditch, I knew that I had made it out. The feeling of relief that washed over me brought with it a smile that was more sincere and joyful than any I had ever worn on my face before. Despite the impulse to quicken my pace when I had my bearings restored and no longer had to watch my North Star so diligently, my feet were in so much pain that I had to be mindful of each step. A distance I had covered in mere seconds, and my nightly exodus from these woods seemed to be never-ending. I walked with a limp in both legs in an attempt to avoid putting too much weight on either foot. But when I saw the edge of the wood's dirt floor cut off by the paved cul-de-sac of my street, I grew so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog, despite how much it hurt. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a lower-set neighboring house, I let out a light sob and ran faster, wincing with each step. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything about any of this to my mother because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back inside, somehow clean up and get in bed. If I were lucky, she would never even have to know about my odyssey. Anything that I might say would sound preposterous, and the thought of this whole experience reaching its end strengthened my resolve to leave it in the past forever once I finally shut that door behind me. However, my heart sank as I rounded the corner and my home came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was awake, and I knew I would have to explain, or at least try to explain, where I had been, and I couldn't figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I ducked under the lowest branch of a large pine tree that stood outside our property, and carefully lifted the metal latch to the gate on the chain-link fence that enclosed our backyard. Slowly, I pushed open the gate in an effort to quiet the squeaking hinges. In about 15 seconds, I would knock on my back door and attempt to explain myself, but I was still reflexively trying to avoid getting caught. I saw my mother's silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, it suddenly didn't matter to me anymore. I was home. It was over. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob. I turned it thinking it might be unlocked since my mother was awake. There was no sense in delaying the inevitable. There was no reason to knock. It turned the full motion, and I felt a mixture of both relief and apprehension. I was just about to push the door open when two arms wrapped around me and pulled me back away from the door. This couldn't be happening. I had evaded and outran my imaginary pursuers countless times in my nightly scramble from the woods, but this wasn't imaginary. I looked at the silhouette in the window and tried to reach out. The arms constricted around my chest and lifted me off the ground while I struggled against them. I looked down at the appendages that had ensnared me. They were small, but there was something covering them. It looked like fur. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut. This can't be happening, my mind roared. The monsters were just pretend. I opened my eyes again and looked at the arms that were crossed over my torso. It was fabric, not fur, but this brought no real comfort. I was still being restrained. I still needed to get help. I screamed as loudly as I could, "Mom, help me, please, Mom!" The feeling of being so close to safety only to be physically pulled away from it filled me with a kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed violently and kicked at the shins of the person holding me. But even if I succeeded in escaping my captor, I knew that I would also have to get away from the person who had just come out of my house, this hulking figure who was now steadily approaching me. He reached his hand out for me, and it extended out of the shadow that had been cast on him by the porch light just above his head. It was a cruel and cracked hand, badly burned, with the consistency of a plastic bag that had melted and cooled. Up until that moment, I had never imagined that I could be in any legitimate danger from which my mother could not rescue me. But as I watched the man close the distance between us, and as I felt my captor's grip grow ever tighter, my fear joined with rage. My mother simply could not be gone. Let me go! Where is she? Where's my mom? What did you do to her? As my throat stung from screaming and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. Honey, please calm down. I've got you. It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as the man who had been approaching me leaned down and put his hand on my shoulder, he eclipsed the porch light with his head, allowing me to see more than just his frame. He was a large man with a tremendous burn scar on his left arm. I broke my eyes away from it and moved them up to his badge. He was a police officer. I turned to face the voice behind me with the hope that it was still tempered by fear. It really was my mom. The dark brown curls of her hair brushed my face as she knelt down to embrace me. I was finally safe. Tears started flowing down my face and I sobbed heavily while the three of us went inside. The back door opened to a narrow hallway. On the right was a door that opened to a bathroom, which was connected to my room via another door. There was a faint smell of mildew that emanated from the bathroom. Nightmares of villains and ghouls that hid in my bathroom meant that I would never draw the curtain closed when I wasn't in the shower, and would only mostly draw it closed when I was. Because of this, water collected in its folds and filled that whole area of the house with the faint smell of watery rot. To the left were our washing machine and dryer. My cat was sitting on the top of the dryer, and I gave him an absent stroke as I walked past and turned toward the dining room. We sat at the table that my mother and I used as a dining area when we ate in a workstation when I had school projects. It was a fairly large square table that had been painted white, but there were several spots where daily use had started to chip the white paint away, revealing layers of different colors on top of the original coat, whatever that might have been. One area looked almost like a cross-section of a Jawbreaker candy, with its concentric and rainbow-colored rings, though my idle or nervous hands had helped along that more excavated section whenever I sat at the table to do homework or have a serious talk with Mother. Historically, the more nervous I was, the more frantically I dug. I learned that night that the first coat of paint was yellow. I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again. She had begun to cry as well. Where did you go? I don't know. I don't know what happened. My fear of the whole event being ineffable was coming true. What do you mean you don't know what happened? Where have you been? Oh, look at you. You're filthy. She surveyed me now that we were in better light. Oh, God. Your feet. I looked down and winced. The tops of my feet were caked in a thick, dark coat of my own blood that had already begun to crack with the pattern of damaged glass. As I moved my feet against the linoleum, I could see that the blood was acting as an adhesive, and I could hear the sounds of my skin peeling free from the floor as I lifted them. You went into the woods? Baby, we've talked about this. I can't believe you. Mom, I didn't. I don't know what happened, I protested. This was quickly becoming an argument, and neither my mother nor I was feeling up to it. It's okay. It's fine, honey. Just don't ever do this again, okay? I'm not sure me or my shins could take it. A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that? I was just afraid you'd run away again. You had just come home. I wasn't about to let you run off again after what you wrote. I was confused. What do you mean? We found the note you left on your pillow, she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and started to read it as my mother and the police officer walked into the kitchen. The note said that I was unhappy and that I never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. It was a running away letter. While the policeman exchanged a few words with my mom, I stared at the letter. I didn't remember writing this letter. I didn't remember anything about any of this. But there were many times when I would do things at night I couldn't remember. I kept reading the letter as I thought about how I would sometimes use the bathroom without remembering getting up, or would wake up and be so tired that I didn't remember the ride to school. But this was different. This was wrong. Even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own and gotten lost, even if all these things were true, one thought repeated endlessly in the background of all the other questions and doubts that filled my mind. This isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter. I'd like to thank everyone again for coming out tonight and having some fun as we sit here and tell some fun, spooky stories. It's been a real treat having you guys here tonight, and I couldn't be happier that you guys seem to have enjoyed yourselves. Camp Streamix is coming to a close, and it's a sad thing, but a good thing nonetheless. We've had an amazing, wonderful summer with each and every one of you. And I am so happy that we experienced all of this as a community. Thank you again for having a moment to sit by the fire and listen to me narrate some stories. I look forward to doing this again in the future. And maybe, just maybe, some of my other friends here at Internet Remix will have a few stories to share of their own. And as we close out tonight, everyone, I just want to leave you with a good night, farewell, and a special thank you from all of us here at Internet Remix and beyond. Thank you. Good night.